The clowns. 3 old men sitting at the counter stopped talking and simultaneously turned their heads towards the jingling of the bells that hung on the front door as a lady walked in. The mostly empty diner fell silent, making the steady click of her high heels sound like a lone horseman riding through a lonesome valley. She walked the whole length of the retro diner that was made up of different shades of light blue, pink orange, and cream colors, right down to the middle-aged waitress's polyester dress and makeup. She stopped in front of the last booth. "Freeman?" Her voice was unexpectedly high and squeaky. "Yes, Fancy, it's me." The man seated in the booth stared up at the strikingly beautiful lady who stood in front of him. "Please, have a seat." She unwrapped the long white overcoat from around her skinny but well-toned body and casually threw it into the booth ahead of her. She was wearing a white, silky mini dress that seemed to droop and cling respectively in all the right places to her extremely pale body. She also had on a giant curly white wig and had a penciled-in black mole right above the crook of her ruby-red lipsticked mouth. As she scooted into the booth, she created an aura of innocence mixed with embarrassment, partly due to the exaggerated pink rouge that covered her cheeks. She looked at Freeman questioningly. "Why are you wearing that ridiculous outfit?" He glanced down at the brightly colored clown suit he was wearing. "Oh yeah, sorry. I didn't have time to change before we met. It's for my work, you see. I'm a professional clown." He looked down at his white-gloved hands that were folded together like a marshmallow orgy. "I like making people laugh." He had a giant, smiling clown mouth painted over his own with red clown paint and was wearing a curly red wig. He looked at her wig and smiled coyly. "I could say the same thing about your appearance, Fancy. What's your excuse?" Her look hardened and her eyes narrowed slightly. "I'm an artist. My life is a canvas, and I express my natural right to be an individual through my personal appearance." She raised her chin up slightly, looking down at him over her nose, and then nonchalantly studied her white painted fingernails. "Yes, some might think it's a glamorous life with all the shows, parties, and traveling, but it's not easy. I do it for my art, to satisfy my muse. He thrives on chaos and depravity. Only quick pleasure and pain will quench his thirst." "Can I get you something, sugar? Some angel food cake, perhaps? Or a glass of milk?" The middle-aged waitress finished her question with a very annoying little chuckle that resembled a baby lamb saying, "Nah." Fancy turned in surprise and looked at the waitress blankly. Yes, I'll have a double latte with organic skim milk and pure unrefined sugar. Both on the side, please." The waitress stared at her for a moment, one hand holding a pot of black coffee and the other resting on her hip. "I'm afraid we don't have many foreign foods or beverages on our menu, dear. You see, we specialize in more traditional food here." Fancy thought for a second and then waved her hand. "I'm okay, actually. Nothing for me, thanks." The waitress turned and extended the hand with the coffee pot menacingly towards Freeman. "How about you, bozo? Another shot of Hot Joe?" He cringed back and, using all of his clown knowledge, raised his arms up in a very convincing don't shoot pose. The waitress laughed again, but this time it sounded as if a wolf had suddenly frightened the baby lamb. "Don't worry, pal, this thing is only loaded with caffeine." She let the lamb bleat some more. "Yes or no, Mr. Funny Guy?" She moved the coffee pot closer to Freeman's cup. An ecstatic expression crossed his face as he shook his head up and down while squeezing an antique bicycle horn that suddenly appeared in his left hand. "Honkity honk, honk, honk." A smile appeared on Fancy's face as she watched the professional side of Freeman in action. "Aha!" He raised his finger as soon as the waitress had left. "I see that you can still smile. Good, very good." She lowered her eyes and tilted her head slightly to the side, but the smile remained. He took a deep breath. "So you were telling me about chaos and depravity mixed with quick pleasure and pain, or something like that, right?" She said nothing for a moment and then looked up at him. "What about you? What have you been doing for these last 15 years? He became serious all of a sudden. "Well, basically, I've been trying to be myself, Fancy." He looked at her seriously, but she laughed. "So you dress up like a clown? You desperately try to make little kids stop throwing their cake and laugh? Is that the way one finds oneself these days?" He made a ha-ha-ha very funny face and continued. "Listen, I'm talking about looking in the mirror and really trying to see me. That me that I don't need to define, create, or influence in any way. That me that was there at my birth, entirely developed, that had rules and restraints piled on it daily until it was almost smothered and turned into a fossil from the pressure that weighed it down. That's what I've been doing." He leaned forward across the table and looked into her eyes. "You know, when we were kids, back when it was just you and me, playing together all our little games, talking in whispers after the lights were turned out, that's when I really felt like I was myself. Like I didn't have to worry about anything. I didn't have to worry about being judged." Fancy, her eyes glistening in the bright lights of the diner, stared back at him as if she had gone back to that time that he had just spoken of. "Listen, every time I put on my clown makeup and costume and enter a room laughing my silly clown laugh to the amazement of the children, just one look of genuine astonishment and surprise on just one child's face is enough to drill a hole through all of those restraining layers that cover me. A gust of fresh air rushes right into my real self's lungs. That look of awe from an uncovered self is the fuel that keeps me going." He raised his finger up and said with intensity, "And I believe from the bottom of my soul, it's everyone's personal obligation to search for his or her true self and to find the work, profession, or passion that will let that true self shine. No one else can do it for you." Silence fell over the table. Freeman leaned back in his seat and, noticing his coffee, took a sip. He lowered the mug to the table and looked at Fancy. "So, what about your job?" She looked at him in disbelief. "Are you serious? How am I supposed to answer that question after that little tirade of yours?" He lowered his head and smiled as she began speaking with a Valley Girl accent. "Well, my job, completely blockades all of the avenues that my poor true self could, use to, make its escape, you know? But, since I was never concerned with its escape until, a few seconds ago, I had been, pretty content to play the game and, reap the benefits. He laughed and shook his head. Sorry, you know how I can get. Anyway, I have to admit that I was impressed when I found your name and picture on the City Dance Theater's website. Co-director and resident artist. Not bad. He lowered the corners of his mouth and nodded his head like people do when they're impressed. But I was lucky I even found you. I had been searching the internet for weeks for you with no luck. I was afraid that you had also disappeared until, as a last resort, I entered my last name as a whim instead of yours. And poof, there you were. She held his gaze for a moment and then lowered her eyes. That happened a long time ago. I had just moved out of a squat house and needed to reinvent myself. I guess I always liked the way your name sounded. She paused for a moment and then smiled. I remember asking Mother years ago, long before they disappeared, if I could change my name also, like she had done when she had married your father. A faraway look seeped into her eyes. Mom was very wise, of course. She said that first, I should get to know who Fancy Parnell is. She was so right. Then she said that if after I turned 18 and had thought about it a whole lot and still wanted to change my name, well, that then I would be an adult and could do whatever I wanted. Her eyes turned to Freeman's. Well, by 20, I was tired of Fancy Parnell, so Fancy Philander was born. It was the only thing that felt right then, really. It was something that I could connect to a time when I was really happy, so... Once in a while, a bus would groan by on the boulevard outside the diner, or one of the 3 old men at the counter would murmur something quite unintelligible to his buddies. Apart from that, except for the clanging of silverware and the rattling of cups, it was silent in the diner. Freeman was studying Fancy from across the table. I miss them too. She was looking down at her nails and then looked up at him questioningly. I was so young. I didn't understand. I still don't really, but who does? Do you? He took a deep breath and lowered his eyes. The death of a parent is... With a violent start, she cut him off angrily. We don't know that they're dead. Come on, Fancy, it's been almost 15 years without a trace or a sign. Yes, exactly. They never found any trace, so technically there is still a chance. You saw the police reports. The Mexican authorities had no evidence of any wrongdoing. There was nothing out of the ordinary. They said it seemed like they just disappeared into thin air. Her bony chest was heaving in and out. Fancy, you're just seeing what you want to see from all of this. They were out in the middle of the jungle. Do you remember what that jungle was like? It used to take 7 machete-wielding Mayans to go before us when we traveled between digs, and those were on the known trails. Field work can be dangerous work. 1,000 different things can go wrong on an archaeological expedition, and unfortunately, it seems that on that one, something did. Fancy fell back in her seat and let her hands fall dejectedly down into her lap. I was only 9. It all happened so fast. You were all I had left. She looked at him. I needed you, but they took you away. I felt so utterly alone. There was no one I could trust. No one to help me understand what was happening to me. She closed her eyes. I began to think that you didn't want to see me anymore. I thought that you surely would have found a way to get in touch with me if you had. Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked at Freeman, who was shaking his head back and forth. Then, after a time, I hated you. He leaned forward quickly. Fancy, you've got to believe me. That's not how it was. His voice was only a whisper, but the words sounded as if they were being screamed. He stared pleadingly at her and then looked away. It wasn't easy for me either, you know. Uncle Larry was the complete opposite from Dad. Narrow-minded, conservative, a real taskmaster at times. I secretly wrote you a letter about 6 months after they separated us. I snuck away and mailed it myself from school. A look of disgust clouded his face. But the mailman in that stupid little town where everybody knew everybody else's business was an old friend of Uncle Larry's from grade school. He gave it back to him after seeing that it was addressed to you. He took a deep breath. I thought about you all the time. There was nothing else to do in that godforsaken town but to think about what was going on in the outside world. They told me that you had been sent to that elite boarding school with all of those rich city kids. They said you had probably already forgotten about me, and that if you hadn't, if you would have seen me on the street, you probably would have pretended not to have known me because it wouldn't have looked very good to your new rich friends to be associating with a poor country boy like me. Fancy's body came to attention in protest, and she opened her mouth to say something, but Friedman motioned with his hand. Don't worry, I didn't believe them. I wasn't that stupid. She shook her head excitedly. Well, I should hope not. Silence fell over the table. She raised her eyebrows and nodded her head. You know, that school was the best thing that ever happened to me. Who knows where I would be now if Aunt Lucy wouldn't have dumped me there. A smirk crossed Freeman's face. Yeah, maybe you'd be sitting in a cheap diner on the wrong side of town wearing an old clown suit. She looked at him in surprise. What's that supposed to mean? Are you jealous or something? Both his hands flew out to his sides, palms up. What? Me jealous? Hell no. I'm glad they didn't spoil me by sending me to a place like that. Her mouth fell open. Spoil you? Spoil you? Her eyes flashed and the words hissed out in a screaming whisper. Fuck you, Freeman. You don't know anything about me. He pointed at her aggressively. Well, that outfit sure screams princess to me. There was a hint of nastiness in his voice. She narrowed her eyes and pointed back at him. You should be careful about judging a person by their appearance while wearing a fucking clown suit, bozo. After a moment, he took a deep breath and extended his palms out towards her with a serious expression on his face. Okay, I'm sorry. I didn't mean that. I don't know where those pent-up feelings came from. Really, that was a stupid thing to say. He looked at her with a forgive me look and continued. Listen, we are two people who were very, very close suddenly meeting again after 15 years. The mixed feelings I have of knowing you so well and at the same time seeing a perfect stranger sitting in front of me is messing with my mind. He leaned forward, placing his hands on his chest and looked directly into her eyes. It's me, Fancy. You know that our connection is special. This kind of special only comes around once in a lifetime, maybe. That's why I looked for you. That's why I asked you to meet me here. I'm an emotional mess and saying stupid things because this means so much to me. He sat back in his seat, took a deep breath, and continued. I'm at an age now where I've been through a few cycles. I've seen the limitations of certain lifestyles, and have been let down a few times. He looked intensely at her. Now I want to have honest and true feelings and have honest and true people surrounding me. The angry and hurt expression that had dominated Fancy's face a few moments ago had gradually dissolved into a look of compassion. She looked down at the table, silently processing everything, and then began to scoot herself out of the booth. I need to go to the ladies' room. Freeman took a deep breath and let his body fall dejectedly down into a seat after she had gone. His eyes drifted to the toned muscles of her dancer's body as she walked to the bathroom at the other end of the diner. She had obviously graduated at the top of her class with a degree in how to walk sexy in high heels. Wow, she's really a woman now, and beautiful. He glanced to his left and saw his reflection in the window. He pulled off his curly red wig and tried to rub his sweaty, tousled hair into place. He looked down at the little spare tire that had developed around his gut. Forget about it, man. A woman like that will never want to have anything to do with someone like you. Then, after a moment, he smiled and gave his belly a few tender little slaps. Hey, I'm a clown. Clowns don't have to be buff. Besides, fat guys are funny. People like to be around funny people. He looked back at his reflection and began adjusting his wig back into position. A whistle came from behind the counter. "Howdy, sailor." The middle-aged waitress waved coyly at Freeman. "Hey, if Snow White doesn't work out for you, my shift finishes at 10. He turned towards her with his left eyebrow turned up and his right one turned down, and let a few honks fly from his horn in response. Another pack of bleeding baby lamb was unleashed from behind the counter and scattered all over the diner right as Fancy was making her way back from the ladies' room. She slid back into the booth and nodded her head in the direction of the waitress. What was that all about? Freeman rolled his eyes. She's crazy, who knows? He studied her for a moment, trying to gauge her mood. She smiled awkwardly as an uncomfortable silence fell over the table. He suddenly took off his white clown gloves and raised his forearms up while relaxing his wrists. A set of lips had been painted on the side of each fist, one obviously female and the other one male. A distorted male voice began to emanate from the vicinity of Freeman's closed mouth as the male lips on his left hand moved up and down.
"So, how's it going, Fancy? What have you been up to for the last 15 years?
Then the female lips on the right hand replied in a squeaky falsetto.
"Gee, I'm just great, Fan. Thanks for asking. I've been doing this and that and blah, blah, blah. And you?" "Me? Well, time flies when you sleep till noon and watch TV all day. But hey, I'm terrific. Fantabulistic. Hey, let's dance."
His arms began to bop on the table as the sound of a trumpet came swinging out from between his lips. The real Fancy let her head fall back and laughed like a little girl. Freeman let his hands fall on the table, and they sat there smiling at each other for a moment. He took a deep breath, and a devilish grin crossed his face. "So, let's move on to the interesting stuff, shall we? How's the love life going?" Her eyes opened wide, surprised by the bold shift in the conversation. "Okay, well, who's got time for love?" Her voice resembled that of a sophisticated lady from the 1940s, with a pinch of Mae West in it. "Frankly, I haven't met a man who was worth spending more than a week with. 2 tops." She smiled, turning back into Fancy, and let her eyes fall onto the table. Maybe it's me. Maybe I expect too much. Most men are pretty stupid or shallow, only excited by cars or sports. The artists are even worse, so self-absorbed and wishy-washy, or flaming, of course. You can forget about the dancers. She sat back suddenly in the booth in a matter-of-fact way. I have a few groupie guys who shuffle around the whole dance art party scene who I sleep with once in a while just to take care of that. Freeman nodded his head awkwardly out of reflex and then looked down at the table, frowning slightly. As if sensing a change in temperature from her last remark, she sat forward quickly. Well, what about you? You must knock the women dead in that outfit. Freeman, losing his frown, leaned back in the booth, striking a macho pose, and nodded his head knowingly. You'd be surprised how many women are caught in my little clown trap. Ask any woman what she wants in a man, and I guarantee that one of the top 3 wishes would be for a man with a good sense of humor. His voice changed into a squeaky falsetto. I want a man that can make me laugh. He smiled, seeking her agreement. Am I right or what? She smiled innocently. So, have you got one trapped right now? An indifferent expression crossed his face. No, not at the moment. I've been taking some time for myself. Trying to get to know myself, trying to find out what it is that pleases me and makes me happy. And that's no easy task, believe me. He rolled his eyes, smiling, and then became a little more serious. I figure that if I can manage to learn that, then I will finally be ready to be with someone, to communicate my needs to them, and to have a chance at sharing some happiness with them. He leaned forward and placed his hands on the table. But I'm in no rush. I lived on the beach for years. I had plenty of sex. I had a relationship too, but it didn't work out. Oh, I'm sorry. What happened? A cloud seemed to pass over Freeman's brightly painted face, but then he chuckled. Well, I came home from work early one day and found the new produce boy from the supermarket where she worked taking a detailed inventory of her personal stock. Fancy quickly reached out and put her hand on his. Oh, Freeman, don't do that. Don't make a joke out of it if it hurts you. I can see that it hurts you. He looked in her eyes that were now very close to his and then looked away. Hey, what do you want? I'm a clown. She looked down at their hands and squeezed his gently. I can't hear this kind of talk that usually happens between strangers that stays on the surface, afraid of going deeper. Not from you. With her left hand, she turned his chin towards her, trying to catch his eye. They looked deeply at each other for a moment. Not from the person in my life who I still feel closer to than any other. Her voice trailed off into a whisper as she lowered her eyes and gently caressed his hands. Freeman looked intensely at Fancy's downturned eyes. He slowly moved his hands until he held hers in his and stared down at her delicate white fingers as he gently caressed them. She matched each little movement he made perfectly, as if their 4 hands were 2 pairs of dancers that were performing an intricate and yet minimalistic dance on the table in front of them. He was breathing long and deep, and a bit of natural redness was now competing with all of the makeup on her cheeks. As if they were now connected into one body, they both began to raise their eyes in what seemed like slow motion until their gazes met, each one pulling the other deep inside beyond the physical reality of flesh. Time stopped. They were alone. Suddenly, they both sat back, and Fancy took her hands away from his, helplessly trying to find something to rest her eyes on besides his. She found her wristwatch. Oh, it's getting late. I should probably start to get going. Freeman shook himself from his daze and nodded his head. Oh, okay, I'll ask for the check. The middle-aged waitress was engrossed in some life-or-death story that one of the three old men was telling, her unblinking eyes watching him as her mouth opened and closed, chewing gum. Fancy watched Freeman carefully as he waved his arms towards his target without results, and then, after a blast from his horn, achieved a perfectly executed check please signal. The middle-aged waitress motioned for them to come, and Freeman began to edge himself out of the booth. He grabbed her coat to help her on with it. I might be a clown, but I'm still a gentleman. He opened his mouth in an exaggerated clown smile, and she smiled back, and then followed him to the counter absent-mindedly as he paid the bill. Remember, 10 o'clock. The waitress made a comically big wink at Freeman. He reacted to Fancy's questioning glance by opening his eyes wide in a who-knows-she's-crazy look as they walked towards the door. The three old men once again stopped everything that they were doing in their honor and stared without shame as they walked out the front door. Outside, the scent of rain was blowing in on the ocean breeze from across the boulevard that ran along the beach. Fancy stopped and wrapped her coat around her better to guard against the cool night air. Funny, I usually roller skate right past this place on the boardwalk every other day. I never thought I would actually go in. Freeman smiled coyly. So you roller skate, huh? What color are your skates? White. She was lost in thought, staring out at the empty black space where the ocean lay. Wow, really? Gee, I would never have guessed. He laughed. Her head darted towards him. Are you making fun of me? Are you laughing at me? He smiled and backed off quickly, extending his palms towards her. No. Now remember, I'm a clown. I'm laughing with you. He stuck his thumb in his ears and began wiggling his fingers while letting out some goofy clown laughs. Come on, laugh with me. It sets the soul free. I'm obsessed with laughter. Come on, try it. Fancy turned away from his antics back towards the invisible ocean with a serious look on her face. Oh, Freeman, what is there to laugh about? We are all alone and struggling. That's not funny. Look at what life has brought us so far. Wasted years of wandering separately. Now it teases us cruelly by letting us see each other again. She glanced back at him. And soon it will throw us apart again to face our futures alone. That's not funny. I can't laugh when this cruel life toys with us so. Not giving up, Freeman kneeled down in front of her and clasped his hands together in a praying position. No. Don't look at it like that. Life is everything, good and bad. We have to laugh at it and with it whenever we can, and then use it to dry our tears. We have to place it up on the highest pedestal, bowing down to it, and then tear off a piece of it to wipe clean our dirty asses. He spread his arms out wide. But the best part about this crazy thing called life is that it's always changing, always presenting us with choices. You see, we are in control, not life. We are the ones that make the decisions. And we are the ones then that have to take the blame. He jumped up and grabbed Fancy's hands in his. What will we decide to do next, you asked? Well, let's do what we feel is best in the moment and take it as it comes. He smiled at her invitingly and giving in, she smiled back. Okay, Mr. Positive, let's do it. I think we had better start trying to make a decision soon that will get us somewhere dry, because I just felt a drop. Freeman let go of one of her hands and raised his clenched fist to the sky menacingly. She laughed and began dragging him by his other hand towards her ride. Holy shit, is that yours? He pointed at the white Harley-Davidson motorcycle he was being pulled towards. Well, a girl's got to get around. A little smile crossed her face. Woo-hoo-hoo, incredible, I can't believe it. When they arrived at the bike, he slid a finger over the radical machine and then, raising both hands to his temples, opened his mouth in disbelief. My God, Fancy, you're like a superhero or a common book heroine or a snow witch, perhaps, ready to wreak havoc all across Tinseltown. Oh, man, I want to see you on this thing. She placed her hands on her hips. Oh, yeah? Well, I'd like to see you without your clown outfit on. It's a little hard to take you seriously dressed like that, you know. Freeman took off his left glove and raised the little hand man to his cheek and then half covered his mouth with his other hand. Hey, what do you think, pal? Is she getting fresh? Dames are suckers for this suit, you know. They can't wait to get me out of it. Oh, Freeman, come on. Sometimes you have to be serious, don't you? She looked at him with a pleading look. Sheesh, how many times do I have to tell you? I'm a clown. Serious is the last thing I'm supposed to be. A slight smile crossed her lips momentarily. I saw that. You smiled. Don't try to deny it. He raised his arms up high and began to dance comically around her and the bike like a drunken father at a Greek wedding. Just then a few more large drops of rain began to fall all around them, and she looked up quickly. Oh no, it looks like one of those flash flood downpours is coming our way. Freeman stopped dancing and raised his fists menacingly at the clouds again. Oh yeah? Well, bring it on! Come on! As if in response to his taunting, a gust of wind brought on a steady barrage of raindrops. Ah, come on! She grabbed his hand and tried to drag him back towards the front door of the diner. But he wheeled around, grabbing onto her other hand, and held her tightly, just as the rain began to fall with a vengeance. What are you doing? Are you crazy? We're going to be soaked to the bone. Freeman started singing and spinning her around in a crazed dance. Soaked to the bone, we're going to be soaked to the bone. The rain suddenly increased in intensity and began pelting them like they were taking a shower. Freeman reached up, threw off his red clown wig, and began frantically rubbing the clown paint off his face. Fancy watched in fascination as his real face began to emerge from beneath the running and blotched remnants of his makeup. He pulled her close, and while holding her firmly with one hand, gently pulled off her wet white wig with the other. The rain began to wash away her makeup, creating little white rivers that ran down her face. With his face only a few inches from hers, he stared into her eyes and then reached up and began to rub the remaining makeup gently but firmly off her face. She closed her eyes and let her mouth fall gently open in ecstasy, her head rolling with his movements. The rain poured down around them, making the parking lot, the diner, and reality disappear into a shimmering and shining make-believe world. Freeman stopped rubbing her face and gently cradled her head in his hands and hungrily looked at her. She opened her eyes and stared into his as tears of joy mixed unnoticed with the raindrops that ran down her now uncovered face.
Yeah, I knew it.
One of the old men inside the diner had squeezed himself into a good spot by the window that looked out into the parking lot. He turned and pointed his finger at the middle-aged waitress. "You owe me $10, Shirley." The waitress threw up her hands in disbelief and started to walk towards the recently vacated booth at the back of the diner. The other two men had joined the first one at the window. "Wow, they're still at it. Look at 'em go." They stood there shamelessly watching Fancy and Freeman like little kids watching two mating rhinoceroses at the zoo. The second old man raised and cupped his hands around his mouth, creating a megaphone. "Get a room!" They began to laugh, that special laugh that only old men can create. At the back of the diner, the waitress threw her wet cleaning rag down onto the table, intent on wiping away all of the evidence that remained of the little reunion. When satisfied that all was obliterated and that the table was sufficiently ready to accommodate the next human drama that would be eventually walking in through the front door, she turned and began walking back down the aisle towards the counter. Damn, now I owe Frank $10. She had already forgotten about Freeman and Fancy.